I've spent much of my academic career to date considering the particularities of past exhibitions that were remarkable, at least in part, for seeking to bring recent art from far-flung places together into a unified realm of relevance. I've studied in much detail certain shows of the 1960s and early 70s that embraced so-called extreme internationalism, and doing that by yoking West European artists to those based in North America and, less often but notably, in additional world regions. Extreme internationalism is a quote from an English curator involved in one of these exhibition initiatives of 1969, and it conveys, I think, the rather grand sense of radicality felt then and there in finding artworks beyond Europe that sit comfortably, indeed belong, in the same space as European art. 2 decades later, in the early 80s and into the 90s, with the tide of capitalist market expansion starting to rise, such provincialism was starting to be washed away by curatorial claims to the coherent display of worldwide or global art. It was no longer enough to be extremely international in one's individual purview. That is, to be very international was no longer extreme enough. Instead, and everywhere, a realm limited only by the geography of the planet itself was purportedly represented through consonant art orchestrated curatorially. And increasingly, contemporaneity was used to name the basis for such curatorial unification. With the spread of biennials foregrounding such art, it then became possible to imagine not only global art collections and a global art history, but also, and here I am personally skewered, global exhibition histories. In all these cases, that is for art collection, art history, and exhibition histories, the global connoted not only everywhere, but also, and less explicitly, the arbitrating taste of those with the power to decide precisely where to focus attention and resources while commanding a significant audience. Who was eligible to exert their taste and what marked the significance of the audience? These were not questions that were fronted. Like many, I always refused claims to global knowledge and to global reach, yet I rarely reflected deeply on the privileges, racialized, linguistic, and educational, that allowed me to represent to others a command of these things. These are some of the books that did that work that I produced with colleagues, or let's say friends and companions. My aim here and now is not just to refuse again the global, but to invoke instead another imaginary. This involves grounding in a given place, and for me that happens to mean in rural Scotland, and at the same time it involves enfolding a careful look to what I will call an earthly context. To be clear about my flex of the English language in this turn of phrase, I'm using a capital E for that earthly, and this is to acknowledge the new imaginary in play, the grounded yet planetary extent of the context at issue. So in seeking to combine situatedness with the earthly, I admit to contradictions rather than hiding them. I want to acknowledge that we all have particular positionalities, particular constituencies, and that we can only speak from and to partiality, however widespread we desire our relevance and usefulness to be. Of course, many authors have been here before me, and I want to acknowledge my debt to the work of Gayatri Spivak in particular. It won't surprise you that environmentalism, ecology, and specific planetary threats to life, issues such as climate crisis and biodiversity collapse, have prompted, shaped, and sharpened my thinking. Today, there's an ever-increasing urgency to look and think both about and beyond the place where we stand, to address a lived interconnectivity, not just with other places, but in a multiplicity of ways with all places. Yet, as Spivak warned over 20 years ago, I am wary of, quote, unexamined environmentalism, referring to an undivided natural space, natural in inverted commas, rather than to differentiated political space, end of quote. And I'm wary of the term ecology, too, to the extent that this implies a related depoliticization, this time from the quasi-objective scientific point of view. Nevertheless, I'm going to stick with the ecological as a term, to the extent that it is bound by a notion of exposability. I insist on exposability in order to foreground the vulnerabilities of life and living. To be exposed is to be laid open, to be left without shelter or defense. Privileges and prejudices may be exposed productively, and there's also exposure to the elements, to matter or to events, to the implacability or embraced by forces beyond us. With exposability held within the frame, ecology may certainly describe the relationships between lives and with environments, but it cannot do so neutrally. Nor only insist upon a locality, it must simultaneously be open to the messy, contested, and precarious hold that lives have on the planetary totality circumscribed by the Earth. Here I am again, seeking to combine situatedness with a carefully enfolded earthly context. So where does art and exhibition, or art's finding of publics, come into this? To be honest, this is where it all started for me and where it always starts. It always starts with art because this is what has the capacity to conjure the imaginary I have sketched, the imaginary between the earthly with a lowercase e and referring to the ground beneath my feet, but also the earthly with a capital E referring to the planetarity. So let me turn to a specific artwork. Expedition, a journey around the west coast in search of tropical Scotland by Melanie Carvalho, is an artist book published in Britain in 2006. A slim book, humbly written and illustrated, it is a travelogue that gently parodies an explorer's diary. Specifically, it charts Carvalho's quest to get familiar with plants, such as the palm tree, that have been introduced to the rural west coast of Scotland from warmer climes, specifically from the tropics. It is illustrated by paintings produced by the artist and by relevant ephemera that she gathered while journeying. The book is a research log for paintings produced by this non-Scottish artist for an exhibition in Scotland. While the paintings she makes are shared in the book, they are so small that they are not the focus, offering her words some colour, shape, and mood. They are made no more nor less sacrosanct than collaged scrapbook additions to a travel journal. Expedition presents itself as what could be called a light read. It gathers personal observations, which sometimes have a deadly honesty, but are also sometimes willfully trivial, and it can be surprisingly funny. While ostensibly about horticulture in a particular part of the world, offering a lived survey of gardening in public spaces on the Atlantic Scottish coast, it is also about being here while from elsewhere, however here and elsewhere might be defined. In amongst Carvalho's notes, for instance, about the weather or the cost of a night's accommodation, and crucially, amongst numerous sightings of palm trees, Expedition neutrally logs various racist microaggressions that the artist encounters or witnesses. It records the casual hostility that may be directed towards those identified as alien within a culture, or indeed within nature as an alien species. The work offers reflection on human migration, read lightly but carefully into the transcontinental circulation of plants. Carvalho adopts something of a persona for her expedition book, that of a botanical artist explorer. She records plant specimens of interest to her research, namely trees and shrubs indigenous to tropical parts of the world, but transplanted to the temperate Scottish west coast. At the same time, however, she charts more than simple botanical presence, noting in particular cross-species relations and lively or struggling connections to land and geography. In other words, she plausibly offers a particular sort of ecological study. As a Londoner and English, Carvalho clearly has no expert local knowledge, no prior lived experience of the places that she's visiting in Scotland. Hence a clear parody of the early transoceanic explorers, specifically the advance guard of British colonialism, and the reports that they sent home. In the second trip that she describes, she refers to her Scottish boyfriend, John, as her native Sherpa, as if he were her Himalayan mountain guide, adding imperiously that, as such, he, quote, will not be credited with a surname, end quote. In this, she mocks her own South Asian heritage, as well as his European, while flagging the extractive history of people from the latter world region acting upon the former, of Britons in India. Yet, while she is clearly conscious that the planting of palm trees decoratively in Scotland writes the country's colonial history into its landscape, Carvalho lives firmly and pragmatically in the present. Human and botanical transplantings are noted unhyperbolically as both felicitous and fearful events, whether a matter of thriving or bare survival, as a reality that should be shared. As you might imagine, I appreciate Carvalho's expedition for speaking from a particular situation while addressing some distant and politically loaded ecological entanglements. However, my desire is not to persuade you that this modest book should enter into some quasi-global canon of art on the basis that it necessarily does the work of what might be called ecological exposure. I want to say something more about what I mean by ecological exposability before coming back to this work of art. Elsewhere, I've argued at some length for using the term exposability in order to nuance Walter Benjamin's concept of Ausstellbarkeit. Literally rendered as exhibitability, Ausstellbarkeit is more commonly features in English language translations of Benjamin's writing as the capacity to be exhibited. The expression features in his now famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of its Technological Reproducibility, where he quietly introduces Ausstellbarkeit as the antithesis to art's aura. While art's aura is measured by cult value, which is determined on the basis of mystical ritual or the cultural norms ordained by an elite, art's exhibition value, or better, exposure value, is grounded in politics or bottom-up discursivity and negotiated possibility. For me, art's exposability maintains something of the magical and ritual possibilities of aura, but it refuses aura's cultic manipulation by power, remaining fugitive. Where aura relies on art's unique existence, originality, authenticity, and command of a fixed here and now, exposability allows for art's circulation, migration, or shifting situatedness, with a new existence to be negotiated every time it's exhibited or exposed. If aura suggests some quasi-eternal status or timelessness, exposability flags instead iterability, the iterability of space-time, or art's needing to resprout in new situations of public engagement if it's going to endure. Art's exposure gives entry onto realms beyond that which might be called one's own, or anyone's own. A here and now is temporarily co-convened and mutually negotiated, a durational field collectively formed. Exposability insists that art can take place anywhere, while conscious that everywhere is not the same, even while everywhere is now connected. When involving here in enmeshed elsewheres, and the not now in enmeshed now, art's ecological exposability encourages attending both to embeddedness and to distribution, an earthly location with lowercase e, and an earthly context with capital E. Ecological exposability resonates with, without suggesting mastery of, the dynamic and imbricated complexities of planetary life. The role for art here lies in its sharing of material and vital wealth, without implying use or exchange value, nor societal health as wholeness. Instead, catalyzing wealth as welfare across bodies, recognizing that lived materiality is interdependent in its fragility. Ecological exposability may be said to describe art's capacity to shape, while being shaped by, a particular natural, cultural, here and now, or durational field, while flagging human entanglement in a more than human web that, at its maximal extent, covers the earth and engages a multiplicity of temporalities. On this basis, when reflecting on the ecological exposure value of a work of art, we need to investigate its operation within a particular durational field, to study the artwork in a given situation, in a specific natural cultural here and now. Further, we're invited to see this here and now as interconnected with an infinity of alternative here and nows, to be open to our implication in ever wider spheres of space and time. So let's return to Melanie Cavala's expedition in order to situate some analysis. Where might this artwork convene a durational field, and how may it conjure ecological exposability now and there? I want to imagine viewing the work in what is perhaps its most ostensibly prestigious home. That is, at Tate Britain in London, where it's held as an artist book in the special collections of the library. In terms of natural cultural resonances, how is expedition shaped by this situation? Or indeed, how is this situation shaped by the artwork? What is exposed ecologically within an earthly context in the event of encountering it here, in this place, today? To consult expedition at Tate Britain, we have to head to the reading rooms, small and hushed spaces, somewhere buried in the bowels of the 19th century neoclassical building that houses the National Collection displays of British art. Here in the reading rooms, we may settle with a book at a leather-topped, solid wood desk, our chairs pulling out and sliding back in silently on a robust carpet. At some point, we might move online to see how some of the sites visited in person by Cavallo have since been captured by so-called street view technology. Although not an option for the artist at the time of making her book, we may now digitally trace the roads that she took in real life. Back in 2004, when Cavallo made her fourth trip around the west coast of Scotland, looking for palm trees, a company called Keyhole was bought up by another then young company, Google. The lure for this business acquisition was Earth Viewer, the software that seeded Google Earth and which had gained attention the year before during the US-led, UK-backed invasion of Iraq, given its three-dimensional flyby imagery of Baghdad. I relay this historical tidbit because the UK's warring presence in Baghdad offers one of many historical backdrops for the production of Cavallo's expedition, with the anti-Muslim sentiment prevalent in the country at the time potentially explaining some of the racism she faces for not looking British, whatever looking British might mean, and just to be clear, it's meaningless. So as we click and rove about on our screens in Tate Britain's reading room, lurching along seashore roads in Scotland, dragging around our point of focus in search of evidence of the longevity of palm trees spotted live by the artist years before, we may also usefully reflect on the history of the technology that makes this possible. The physical setting we now find ourselves in encourages both national and corporate reflections. The institution of Tate is named after a Victorian sugar magnate who donated his personal art collection to the British nation while contributing to the costs of erecting the purpose-built galleries that opened in 1897 and can be visited today. Resonating through the grandeur of the architecture, the name Tate proudly announces the capital gains made from the industrial production of refined sugar in the UK. This is a process indebted to the importation of unrefined sugarcane from plantations imposed on lands brutally colonized by the British, notably in the Caribbean, a region of the world that is, we might note, otherwise renowned in the tourist industry for beaches fringed with palm trees. While we're in London at Tate Britain, I want to take you on a quick walk up through the old building and into the postmodern extension on the other side, which was built in the 1980s to house the bequest of the work of Joseph Mallard William Turner. We're heading for the Prints and Drawings Room, another space designed for individualized study, which I'd like to open up to the possibility of exhibition through virtual visitation with you now. I want to look at a particular work of art from Tate's collections here, or indeed, since the work is not framed and mounted on a gallery wall, but instead will be brought out to us to inspect as an object in the room dedicated precisely for this, I want to show you the back of a particular work of art. Around 1798, Turner painted a watercolour of cattle being herded in the foothills of a Welsh castle, and thus, together with some 30,000 other sketches and 300 oil paintings, these are preserved by Tate Britain for the nation. On the back of this one work are pencil drawings, doodles really, of palm trees. They look so quickly generated, so incomplete, just the outline of a couple of leaves in one instance and of the crown of a tree in the other, that it's tempting to see an urgency, a fascinated but unresolved compulsion to understand in the pencil marks. It's impossible to know for sure if these palms were drawn from life and whether in the same year as the watercolor on the other side. More certainly, however, just 5 years earlier, 2 fan palms entered the plant collection kept by the British Royals at Kew Gardens, near London, following extraction from the Caribbean by the British Royal Navy. And at least 10 palm species imported from the tropics more widely were in the collection at this time already. While Kew Gardens were not yet open to the public at the end of the 18th century, I understand it was still possible to visit by appointment, accompanied by a gardener. And so perhaps Turner did this. Or perhaps he saw and drew palms in the conservatories at Fonthill, an English estate that was part funded through sugar plantations and slave labor in the Caribbean, an estate where Turner was commissioned to paint the abbey. I want to suggest that spending time with Carvalho's expedition publication in the museological context of Tate Britain today, with some simple Turner sketches made 200 years previously, resonating sympathetically under the same roof, adds some critical ecology as well as some useful politics to the conventional history associated with this institution. This slim book, together with the hasty doodles, are safely housed, as if for eternity, by this imposing building. Yet, while the fragile papery forms in themselves, not unlike the precarious, transported palm trees' lives they document, while they're fragile, they nevertheless trouble the grand building's foundations, messing productively with the proclaimed national mightiness. Here, expedition quietly implicates Britain in a picture of ecological devastation that now, through industrialized capitalism, circumscribes the earth, with impacts suffered in some places more than others, by some lives more than others. The work encourages us to learn something about, to feel something for, the relationships between palm trees and sugarcane across disparate environments and crisscrossing several centuries. It now not only highlights the fortunes of tropical plants imported into this temperate island, but it also channels all the ghosts haunting the monocrop plantations maintained from here on those distant lands. Personally speaking, reflecting on Carvalho's expedition at Tate suggests an ecological reading that exposes my Britishness, engaging me in a natural cultural context that I usually choose to play down as defining my nationality, precisely because that context extends across the world and over several hundred years with numerous devastating consequences. Before concluding, I want to consider Carvalho's publication very briefly in another situation, one rural rather than urban, which, while remaining in Britain, involves moving north, out of England and into Scotland. We're going to imagine travelling to the village of Cove in Argyll, where you might study expedition as a book like any other, in the volunteer-run community library at Cove Borough Hall, or in the open shelves of Cove Park, a base for temporary artist residencies and for occasional public art events. Needless to say, perhaps, the book lives in both these places because it was made about the region, about the west coast of Scotland. And whichever of the two places we choose to sit in to study it, the work colours an impression of the landscape and tidal lochs outside of the windows. While it opens our eyes to surprising numbers of palm trees locally, it also connects us along the River Clyde and out to the sea to Portugal, India, Uganda, Zambia, New Zealand, and China, for instance, since all these places are referenced in its pages. The Clyde coast is tended by the warmth of the Gulf Stream, which brings tropical waters northwards and transformed in the Victorian era into a holiday retreat for wealthy Glaswegian industrialists, it belatedly gained palm trees as they came to symbolize tourist escapism. After consulting Expedition in Cove, it seems impossible not to see the flip side of that historical wealth generation, that is, coloniality, inscribed into the surrounding landscape through the sporadic presence of palm trees. Moreover, since the arrival of Carvalho's book in Cove over 15 years ago, there's been a shift in understanding of the local environment in Argyll, specifically a marked increase in the awareness of the temperate rainforests that centuries ago covered much of the coastline. A British researcher, writer, and campaigner recently captured the national imagination with the idea of tracing and recovering this vestigial habitat. Guy Shrubsholl writes, quote, "A temperate rainforest is a wood where it's wet and mild enough for plants to grow on other plants, proving green all year round due to the plethora of mosses and lichens," end quote. Scottish rainforests, largely constituted of oak, birch, and hazel trees, have been described as biodiversity reservoirs and now cover just 30,000 hectares. So, looking at Carvalho's expedition in the context of Argyll today might include analysis of the historical destruction of the local landscape of ancient rainforests in order to pursue pine plantations for timber and wood pulp production on the one hand, and to host animal grazing, dairy, cattle, and sheep farming for the national and international food industry on the other. This history runs in tandem to the smaller scale development of domestic lawns and gardens and green public spaces where palm trees are sometimes cultivated. Yet the two histories are intertwined, and studying expedition while sat at Cove Borough Hall or Cove Park can help us to unravel, or indeed to be unraveled by, the complex connections of humans to animals and to plants within this landscape, but with a reach that extends far and wide around the world. Spending time with Carvalho's expedition today in the context that produced it 2 decades ago, I learn what the edited anthology titled Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet instructs more explicitly. Quote, "Landscapes enact more than human rhythms. To follow these rhythms, we need new histories and descriptions crossing the sciences and humanities." This more or less describes what I now want to write. After a long time pursuing what might as well be referred to as global exhibition histories, I now seek to affirm and expand upon art in situations that allow a performance of ecological exposability, implicating me locally and simultaneously in an earthly context, which might also implicate you.